Hello learners, welcome to our session today. I am your instructor CPA Ringo Frederick. Our session today, Mwalimu is very excited because we are looking at our revisions. And our session will be looking at financial management and the concept that I want us to focus on, which you know that this concept was introduced fully in this current syllabus. So you must be very, very familiar with this concept when it comes for your examination, more so if you are a student doing financial management KASNEB from 2022 going onwards. Still, maybe they change it again, right? So our concept today, I want us to focus on an area of portfolio analysis. This is a very important concept at this level, and also I know some concepts for students who are doing advanced financial management, they can also grasp some concept as we continue, right? So anytime you're looking at portfolio analysis, just to give you a brief overview, then we look at a question for our revision today. Of course, you've done so many questions in relation to our revision. So looking at a portfolio analysis, my good student, the whole concept behind it is that you are an investor. You've invested in various sectors of the economy. And of course, after investments, there is no investment that will come risk-free unless you've invested in government securities. So any investment will always be attached to the component of risks. So now we want to look at the aspect of the return that you should expect, or rather the risk attached to these investments that you have diversified them in various sectors of economy. So bringing all your investments together is what you are terming now as what? As portfolio. Bringing all your investments together is now what you are terming them as what? As portfolio. So our case here as a financial managers, or rather as financial management student, you will find that it will be upon you to analyze the risk attributed, the risk attached to each portfolio that you have placed your investment. And in that case, as I've said, portfolio basically is just collection of many investments that you're having as an investor. So having noted that one, area that I want us to concentrate mostly is in regard to how to measure risks on these investments of ours. Because as at the end of the day, I am going to expect risks in all these investments. So our task here is for us to measure risk. For us to measure risk attached to this aspect of our investments. So you're talking about measuring of risks. Measuring of risks. So measuring of risks, my good students, anytime you're talking about aspect of measuring risk at this level, I'll be talking of four main methods that you're going to use. Number one, it will be upon us to understand the concept to do with expected return. Expected return. Talk about aspect number two, to do the concept of variance. Number three, my good students will be expected to understand the whole concept of what? Standard deviation. Standard deviation. As well as you'll also be expected to know the concept to do here with what? The concept to do, of course, with the concept to do with what is known as a coefficient of variation. Coefficient of variation. Coefficient of variation. Coefficient of variation. And the good thing that all of these concepts, you'll find that they do relate. That's a good thing with portfolio. Once you're able to understand the concept, you'll find that it will just flow all through. So very quickly, looking at expected returns, very quickly looking at A, which is our expected returns, my good students, what should we be able to understand anytime you're talking about expected returns? Expected returns, basically you're looking at it as what? As a form of average. But this average, remember, we are incorporating what? We are incorporating probability. Because I'm investing somewhere where I don't know what I'm going to earn. But in this case, I can be able to attack the probabilities on these investments of ours. And that's why we're talking about expected return. What is the average returns that I can earn out of my portfolio? What's the average return that you can earn out of our portfolio? And that's why you're saying that expected return, basically, it is the mean average or the return of a given project or investment. That is the weighted average. And the question that you're going to ask yourself is, how will you determine your expected return, my good students? For us to determine our expected return, my focus is I'm looking at average. And at this point, we are incorporating our probabilities. So therefore, To determine our expected returns, that will be very simple, because you're going to take your return, you multiply by your probability. Remember, you're not looking at one investment, you're looking at several investments. Therefore, you do what? You sum up. That will give what? Your expected return. You're taking the return that you're having for each investment, you multiply by the probability, and as we have mentioned earlier, portfolio, I'm looking at collection of investments. So therefore, we do what? We sum it up. Therefore, in this case, you're going what? To sum it up based on the aspect of when are we investing. This is the state of nature that we are investing in. So you'll find that this will give us what? The expected return. As simple as that. That should take us to variance. Now, number B, variance, you'll find that anytime you're talking of the variance, basically it will relate with the expected return. It basically relates with expected return. And before we go to variance, my good students, so you should understand that anytime you're talking of expected return, basically, at this point, you normally tend to say that the higher the expected return, of course, the higher the expected return, the higher the risk. That is what you normally tend to look at, right? So that is what you should always be having at the back of your mind. Look at variance. Look at variance. Variance, basically, it relates with expected return. And how is it relating with expected return? So you'll find that basically variance, it is just a measure of what? Variance, you'll find that it is a measure of percentage change. Kindly mark that very clearly. We are saying that variance is basically the percentage change, or rather measure of the percentage change between the expected returns and the actual returns. I hope you've mastered that very clearly. Just measure of the percentage change, of course, between what? Between the expected returns and the actual returns. So then, how will you determine your variance, my good students? For you to determine your variance, you'll find that it will be very simple, because whatever that you're going to do, we're going to take our return here, right? We multiply, of course, in this case, we take our return. That should give us our return. That is, we less, because I want to measure that difference, right, between the expected and the actual. So we less the expected return. What I should not forget is to square that one. Expected, talk of what? The aspect of average. Talk about the aspect of what? Because talk about the aspect of average. And because I'm looking at various investments at different level of, or rather a different state of economy, don't forget what? Summation. Don't forget about the summation. So basically, we're looking at the difference between our return, our actual return, and the expected return. Remember, we have computed the expected return when we started. Then we square that one, we multiply by our probability. And because I'm looking at it at different levels of economy, therefore we need to sum them up of that investment. We need to sum up all these aspects of what? All these aspects of the returns minus expected returns, of course, of different state of economy. So that at the end of the day, this should give us our variance. Just look at the way it is simple. You'll find that this one relates with this one. Again, when we are looking at standard deviation, we'll find that there is a connection. Talk about standard deviation, my good students. Talk about standard deviation. You'll find that we'll be having a connection again with the variance. And therefore, when you're talking of standard deviation, basically, what should you be able to understand? Anytime you're talking about our standard deviation, my good students, what should come at the back of your mind? You'll find that standard deviation, basically, it is an extreme, or rather it is an extension of what? It is an extension of our variance here. It is an extension of our variance. Basically, standard deviation is an extension of the variance, meaning that once you've grasped and you've understood the variance, coming to standard deviation, it will be very, very easy. And before we forget, you'll find that anytime you're talking of variance, you normally tend to say that the higher the variance, of course, the higher the risk. The higher the variance, the higher the risk. Standard deviation, we are saying it is an extension of the variance. And how is it an extension of the variance in this case? Already I have determined our variance here, right? Already we have determined our variance, whereby you say that our variance, basically, I'm going to take my return. actual minus expected return, of course, square times probability summation. Why are we terming it as an extension of the variance? Simply because for standard deviation, what you are going to introduce is only square root. Simple, right? I'm only going to introduce what? I'm only going to introduce square root on that. I'm only going to introduce square root on our, I'm going to introduce a square root on the formula of what? On the formula of the variance. So therefore, this would give us what? Our standard deviation. So in simple terms, we are saying that our standard deviation basically is square root of what? Is square root of our variance. Is square root of our variance. Basically, we are saying that our standard deviation is basically square root of our variance. As simple as that, as simple as that, as simple as that. Now, let us go to the last bit, which in this case, we are talking of D, because you see that we'll be having 4 main. That is a coefficient of variation. Talk about coefficient of variation, coefficient of variation. Now, these things are like family, right? They do relate. They have blood relationship, right? They are like family. They have blood relationship. Because in this case, you'll find that if we were to take their DNA, they will be kind of lead us to the same thing. So at this point, you'll find that now, when you're talking about the coefficient of variation, again, it relates to the standard deviation and what? And expected returns. So this is just an extreme measure of risk. Anytime you're talking about coefficient of variation, basically you normally tend to look at it as what? As an aspect of an extreme measure of risks, which compares the standard deviation with the expected return. CV, we are saying CV, it is an extreme measure of risk where we are going to compare our standard deviation and what? And our expected return. So therefore, to say our CV, we should be talking of our standard deviation. We divide by what? We divide by our expected returns. We divide by our expected returns. We divide by our expected returns. So that is how we can determine, that is how we can determine our CV. That is how we can determine our CV. That is how we can determine our CV. Now, after we have talked of this, there's a very important concept that I want to bring to your attention. At this point, these are for aspects of a single project, right? And for examination purpose, when you are told to measure or to determine the risk of the investment, our focus mainly will be on the standard deviation. But many a times, my good students will be given a standard deviation in terms of what? In terms of the many investments that you are having. We are not doing it on a single investment, but you want to determine the standard deviation of the measure of risk of the whole portfolio that you are having. So in this case, I want to bring to your attention this concept of what? Standard deviation of a portfolio. Standard deviation of a portfolio. Because all this will just be the same except for standard deviation when you want to determine the standard deviation of the portfolio. Standard deviation of the portfolio. So looking at the standard deviation of the portfolio, these are what we should always be able to have at the back of our mind, my good students. Because at that point, we'll be looking at for single project. Now, talk about the standard deviation of the portfolio. How will you determine the standard deviation of the portfolio? To determine the standard deviation of our portfolio, to determine the standard deviation of the whole collection of our investments, again, it's simple. You shouldn't worry. But this time around, you're going to introduce an element known as the weight, right? Proportion of my investment. Assuming I'm having investment A, investment B, investment C. I just want to determine the proportion. I'll have to determine the proportion of investment A to our total, the proportion of investment B to our total, the investment of proportion C to our total. And this is what will give us our weight. So that is to say, Mwalimu is trying to say that for us to determine our standard deviation of the portfolio, this is what we'll be having. For us to determine the standard deviation of our portfolio, we are going to take weight of, say, investment A. We do what? We square that one. We multiply by the standard deviation of portfolio A. We do what? We square that one. Of course, as at the end of the day, I'm going to add what? We are going to add the aspect of the weight of the investment B. We square. We multiply by the standard deviation of investment B. We square that one. Allow me to erase here so that in this case we should just be having one formula all through. So therefore, in this case, consider what? I'm going to introduce a new element here known as what? Coefficient, correlation coefficient. Correlation coefficient, whereby you're going to take two, that is of course two covariance, which is correlation coefficient, covariance of weight of A and weight of B. So that as at the end of the day, we should not forget what? We should not forget to square root that one. So basically, this will give us the standard deviation of, our portfolio. This should give us the standard deviation of our combined investments, whereby we are talking about the weight of A, which you must determine. And again, the good thing is that you have a question which we're going to look at right now, times the standard deviation, of course, of security A. In this case, you're going to add the weight of B times standard deviation of security B plus the two covariance of weight of A and weight of what? Of B. So once you're able to determine that, that will make our work to be very, very easy. And it's as if we've done the whole summary of what you are expected to know when it comes to what? When it comes to portfolio. Except that I'm going to show you guys the easiest way that you can determine correlation coefficient. So to this point, let us jump to this question that Mwalimu wants us to handle. This paper was tested in December 2021, question number 2C. This question was tested in December, actually a last sitting question. Remember, this concept was introduced partly last sitting. So this is our question here. This is our question. I've shared the question there where we are told that the following data shows the returns of two stocks, A and B, and their respective probabilities of occurrence. I'm given probability, I'm given our return of stock of A and return of stock of B. Then I was told, number one, required here, very simple, the examiner wanted me to determine what? The expected return of stock A and the expected return of stock B. Number two, we are required to determine the standard deviation of returns of stock A and stock B. The standard deviation of the return of stock A and what? And stock B. Then finally, the examiner wanted us to determine what? We are told that suppose that a portfolio is created composed of 70% of A and 70% of B. Determine this portfolio risk in terms of portfolio standard deviation. Surely, my good students. And Mwalimu has given us that point here. And Mwalimu has already given us this point here. Already we have that formula here. Already you have this formula here. So you'll find that working it out, it will be very simple. Now, let us compute that question and you'll see why Mwalimu is saying that portfolio, so long as you've understood the concept that we've given earlier on, all these other things will just be a matter of what? Copying and pasting. All these other elements will just be a matter of us to copy and what? To copy and paste, to copy and paste, to copy and paste. So therefore, this is what you should have. Allow me to erase here. So we are looking at that question, December 2021. The question is with us there. So I'm having December 2021, right? So collect the figures that I'm given there. Collect the figures that you are given there, my good students, which in that case, we have what? In that case, you can clearly see I was given our figures for return of A and return of B. So in this case, allow me to squeeze this question somewhere down here. I think that will be on a good position. So these are what we need to do. We need to determine, number one, the examiner wanted us to determine the expected returns of stock A and stock B. So I'm required to determine the expected return. And the good thing is that already when we started, we had a formula, right? We had a formula. So having this formula of ours, I need expected return, of course, of A and expected return of B. This is how we are going to do it, my good students. Just see how simple it will be, right? Just see how simple it will be. For, in this case, I'm having aspect of a probability of 0.3, probability of 0.3, and probability of 0.4. This will apply for both return of stock A and return of stock B. So therefore, if I'm required to determine for stock A, how will you go about it? Given the fact that we need to determine the what? The summation. This will be very simple, my good students. I'm going to take the first case. I'm having the first return of A is how much? I'm given 10. And what is the probability that I'm going to earn that 10? In this case, I'm given 0.3. We are going to add what is the return of the other bit you are still in A at 0.3. I can expect also 7, and the aspect of probability is 0.3. Then lastly, I can have 13, whereas my probability of us earning 13 is 0.4. So we've said that we'll be talking of what? The aspect of summation. Recall the formula that we'll be talking of summation of what? My return times probability. Recall that? Summation of return times our probability. So therefore, we can agree that at that point, what are we going to have as our expected return? Our expected return will be simple there. Mwalimu is taking his calculator so that we work it out together. I'm having 10 by 0.3. We are going to add, of course, 7 by 0.3. I'm also going to add, of course, 13 by 0.4, which in this case, my good students should give us what? 10.3. What about B? I know you feel, I know you know how, I know you're feeling how simple it is, right? I know you're feeling how the concept is kind of sinking in, even if it's your first class attending the class, or rather first time attending this class of ours, right? So on B, we do have, I'm having 8. You can clearly see there I'm having 8. 8 we multiply, of course, by what? 8 we multiply by probability, which was 0.3. We are going to add, of course, the other return here. I'm given the other return. I'm given, of course, 12 by probability 0.3. We're also going to add, of course, what? I'm given here. That is, of course, return of 7 by 0.4. So in this case, this should give us how much? This should give us how much? This should give us how much? Just see how simple it is. I'm going to take 8 by 0.3. 8 by 0.3. We are going to add, of course, 12 by 0.3. I'm going to add 7 by 0.4, which in this case should give us a figure format. Mwalimu is getting 8.8. Kindly, you can confirm. So in this case, we have already determined our expected returns. We have already determined our expected returns. That is 8, 12, 7. Kindly confirm with your figures. Kindly confirm with your figures. So once we have that case, we have determined our expected returns. The next question, what were we required to do? What were we required to do, my good students? The next question here, we are required to do what? To determine the standard deviation of return of stock A and stock B. Standard deviation of stock A and stock B. And by now, if you've started with us, you know how to determine our standard deviation, right? So number 2, the examiner wanted us to determine our standard deviation, And I know if you've started with us, by now you should be able to know how to determine our standard deviation. Because we say that once we have our expected return, determining our standard deviation will be very easy. And how will you determine that? I know very well that here I'm going to take our expected, or rather our actual return. That is, of course, our actual return. I'm having our actual return. Of course, we less our expected return. I know very well that I should not forget what? I should not forget aspect of what? I should not forget our square root, or rather not square root, but squared. In that case, times probability. This case, you're talking of what? Summation. Then one thing that we should not forget on standard deviation is what, my good students? We have to do what? We have to square root that one. So that is to say, I'll have to determine my variance. Then from my variance, we square our variance. Alternatively, determine your variance. Then from your variance, we just square. So how will you go about it? That will be simple again. Just here it is. And I want this thing to sink at the back of our mind so that at any given point when you kind of find this question somewhere, it will be very, very easy for you to work it out, right? That is what I want us to have. That is what I want us to have. That is what I want us to have. So therefore, determining that one, this is what we are going to do. We are going to start with A. Standard deviation of A. Let us determine our variance. I'm having the first case, our return here. The first one I'm having 10. We do have 10. 10, and we do have a 10 minus expected return. expected return of A, I'm having 10.3. I know very well I'm going to do what? I'm going to square that one. We multiply by the probability. What was our probability in this case? The first one, probability, I'm having 0.3. The other one, I'm having 7. We multiply by, or rather we less what? Expected return of A, so you had already determined to be 10.3. Then we square that one times probability, which is 0.3. We take the last one here, I'm having what? I'm having 13. So we're having 13 minus 10.3. We square this one. Of course, I should not forget our probability, which is 0.4 for the last one. So that as at the end of the day, whatever that I'm determining here is our variance, right? Whatever that we're determining here is our variance. Therefore, my variance, we should be talking of what? I'm having, of course, 10 minus 10.3. Minus 10.3. We square that one. We multiply by 0.3, which is our probability. This case should give us 0.027. Then the other one, I'm talking of 7 minus 10.3. Of course, that one squared times 0.3 should give me a figure of 3.267. Then lastly, we are talking of 13 minus 10.3. In that case, of course, we square that one times 0.4. In this case, should give me a figure of what? 2.916. So that summation, that should give us what? Plus 3.267 plus 0.027 to give us a figure of 6.21. 6.21. This is our variance, right? That is our variance that we determine. And our main interest is what? Our main interest is to determine the standard deviation. So how will we determine our standard deviation, my good students? That will be simple. Because our task here, whatever that we're going to do, we just do what? We just square root our variance. We determine the square root of our variance, which in that case should give us what? I'm having 6.21. If I determine the square root of that case, Mwalimu is getting a figure of 2.49. 2.49. 2.49. That is for A. That is for A. That is for A. That is for A. What about for B? The same concept will apply, my good student, for B. And I know now for B, you can determine for Mwalimu very quickly. If I leave it for you, can you determine that figure for Mwalimu? Can you determine the standard deviation for Mwalimu? I know it will be very easy because his our revision will say that Mwalimu afanye nini? Mwalimu afanye kazi yake. Right? Mwalimu afanye kazi yake. And that is what we are going to do here. Probably for those who kind of are not listening to, or rather you can't hear Kiswahili, Mwalimu afanye kazi yake. The teacher should do his or her work. Right? So in this case, we are talking about B. For B, therefore, at this point, we are talking about, I'm having our return, with the first one we had 8. So I'm talking of 8 minus 8.8 expected return. We square this one times what? Probability to 0.3. We are taking the second one, return, I'm having 12 minus 8.8, which is our expected return. We square this one times 0.3. We take 7, my good students, minus 8.8. We square this one, we multiply by the probability of 0.4. So I'm having 0.4 here. So that is to say that at this point, I can determine our variance, right? And how will you determine our variance? I take my calculator. At this point, in this case, remember for exam purposes, you can do it directly. Mwalimu is doing here so that you can get the concept clearly. But for exam purposes, you can always do that directly. So in this case, I'm having 8 minus 8.8. We square that one minus 0.3 to give us 0.34. The other one I'm having 12. I'm having, of course, 12 minus 8.8. 12 minus 8.8 squared times 0.3. Mwalimu is getting here 3.072. 3.072. We do have, of course, 7 minus 8.8. We square 8.8. We square that one times 0.4. In this case, we should get a figure for much. 1.296. 1.296. So that, to say that one, that is to say, we should be having a figure format there. We should be talking of a figure of, if we do the summation, 0.34. We add 3.072. We add 1.296. So that case should give me a figure of what? I'm getting a figure of 0.708. That is what? Our variance. But our interest is on what? Our interest is on the standard deviation. So therefore, how do you determine our standard deviation? I just introduce square root. So therefore, we can say that the standard deviation of this item of ours is square root. Answer to give me 2.16, or rather 2.17. 2.17 will be our standard deviation. And basically, that is what you're required to do in that question. Specifically, part A and part 1 and part 2. Look at number 3. Number 3 now, it is very interesting because here the examiner is asking us about what? If you can check that question. The examiner here is asking us to determine the standard deviation of the portfolio. Standard deviation of the portfolio. The question that you're going to ask yourself is this. Do you know the formula of determining the standard deviation of the portfolio? That is a very important question that you should ask yourself. Do you know how to determine the standard deviation of the portfolio? Do you know? That's a question that you're going to ask yourself. Already when we started, as much as our revision, I took you through the concept of standard deviation of the portfolio. So the same case, I'm going to repeat it here. So my standard deviation of the portfolio, we say that anytime you're talking about the standard deviation of portfolio, in this case, I'm looking at investment A and investment B. What should we be having? In this case, we should be talking of, first of all, I'm going to consider the weight of A. We square, we multiply by the aspect of standard deviation of A, we square. We are going to add, my good students, the weight of investment B, we square, times the standard deviation of investment B, we square. I should not forget what? 2 covariance of the weight of A and weight of what? Weight of B. So that as at the end of the day, my good students, we should always recall that I should not forget what? I will never forget, just a moment here. I will never forget the aspect to do with the square root. So I believe that one is visible. So we should not forget the aspect to do with what? To do with square root. So talk about our square root. Now, the case here is upon us to determine what we are given. I need to have the weight of A and weight of B. My good student, the good question is, were you given this weight of A and weight of B? Were you given in that question? Look at that question clearly. Look at this question here. Now, this is an area that you should pay attention very much. Look at that case. Suppose that a portfolio is created composed, we are in number 3. Suppose that a portfolio is created composed of 70% of A and 30% of stock B. Determine this portfolio's risk in terms of portfolio standard deviation. So already we can agree that I am given the weight of A and weight of what? Weight of B. So in this case, you can agree that the weight of A is 0.7 and weight of B is 0.3. Exactly what I'm given there. Right? Exactly what I'm given there. Now the task will be for us to determine what? For us to determine the covariance. That will be our task, for us to determine the covariance. Now, at this point, my good student, you should be smiling. Why should you smile? You should smile because to determine the covariance, in this case, I'm having the covariance here. We do have the covariance, of course, of A and B. So to determine the covariance of A and B, this will be simple. And if possible, let me remove this question so that you can have a very clear visual of how to determine the covariance. To determine the covariance of A and B, whatever that you're going to do, I'm going to take return of A minus expected return, or rather, in this case, that is a return of A. We multiply by expected return of what? Of A. How do you determine the expected return? Of course, you are determining the expected return. That is, of course, not minus, but sorry, less. That is return of A minus expected return of A. We are going to multiply by what? We are going to multiply by the return of B minus expected return of what? Expected return of B. All of these, you should not forget what? You should not forget your probability. You should not forget your probability. Then you know very well, I should determine what? I should determine the summation of that. I should determine the summation of that. I should determine the summation of that. So once we have that, and we had already computed everything, right? We had already computed almost everything. We had already computed almost everything. So our task here will just be a matter of us to copy and to paste. So therefore, my covariance here, what should we be having? We start with the first one. Return of A, the first one I'm having what? 8. Minus expected return of what? A, I'm having expected return, or that is, A. Sorry, we're talking of A. A is here. A is here. We had 10 minus expected return, which is 10.3. We multiplied by return of B, which in this case is 8, the first one, minus expected return, which is 8.8. The solution that I'm going to get there, we're going to multiply by the probability. The first probability we had what? 0.3. The next element we should be having, the second one we are talking of 7, right? So I'm having 7 minus 10.3, correct? We multiply by 12 minus 8.8. Recall this one, the second bit, times the probability, which is 0.3. The other one, what should we be having? The other one I'm having, the last one here, we're having 13 minus 10.3. I believe that my board is still visible. We multiply by the last one here, 7 minus 8.8 times probability, 0.4. So therefore, what should we be having there? I want you to compute for Mwalimu and give Mwalimu the solution on that and see how this thing is very simple. So I'm going to take my calc. We take 10 minus 10.3. 10 minus 10.3. We multiply by 8 minus 8.8. I multiply by probability 0.3. So in this case, I'm having 0.072. So 0.072. The other one we are talking of 7 minus 10.3. 7 minus 10.3. Of course, we multiply by 12 minus 8.8 times 0.3. That should give us how much? Minus 3.168. Correct? Then lastly, here we are talking of what? We are talking of aspect to do with 13 minus 10.3. I multiply by 7 minus 8.8. We multiply by aspect of what? We multiply by, of course, 0.4. So that should give me minus 1.944. Kindly confirm if Mwalimu is getting correct figures or Mwalimu is doing his own things. So minus that plus minus 3.168 plus 0.072. So in this case, I'm getting negative 5.04. Negative 5.04. That is what Mwalimu is getting as the covariance. So that will be our covariance. And kindly confirm if you are getting the same answers. So once we have our covariance now, our task will be easy. I'll just take my case here. I'll just take, of course, our case here. In this case, remember, we are looking at this was a standard deviation of A and B. So therefore, we are going to take we want to determine that standard deviation. Of course, we are looking at a standard deviation of A and B, right? We are looking at standard deviation of A and B. So therefore, in this case, I'm going to take my weight of A, 0.7 squared. I multiply by standard deviation of A. Standard deviation of A, we got a figure of what? 2.49 squared. We are going to add, of course, what? We are going to add here, we are going to add weight of B, 0.3 squared. We multiply by standard deviation, 2.17 squared. We add 2 times covariance, 5.04. That is negative 5.04 covariance, times the weight of A, 0.7, times the weight of B, 0.3. So that as at the end of the day, my good students, what will you be having as the standard deviation of this portfolio? What will you be having as a standard deviation of our portfolio? So to determine that case, allow me to erase now here. What I'm going to do, I'm just going to insert all these figures directly in our calc. We're going to insert all these figures just directly in our calc, whereby I'm going to have, of course, that is, of course, 0.7 squared times 2.49 squared. I close the bracket. I'm going to add 0.3 squared. We multiply by 2.17 squared. We close the bracket. Then we plus 2 times negative 5.04 times 0.7 times 0.3. So in that case, should give us how much? I'm having 1.34505. I determine the square root of that to give me what? So therefore, I can comfortably come and say that the standard deviation of our portfolio here, I'm having 1.1598. So that will be the standard deviation of the combined, the standard deviation of the portfolio. And basically, that is what you are required, that is what you're required to do. Remember, that was only the first part of our block model paper question. So you can get more of these questions, of course, in our phone application, or you can contact us via the number below to get more of this block revision. To this point, thank you guys, and let us meet in the next session. Thank you.